at 6 in the morning, with the neighborhood still dark. My mother-in-law parked in my driveway and delivered one sentence: "Do not go home today." She did not cry or explain, just warned me to stay where people could see me. By evening, facing changed locks, a ransacked office, and a blinking red camera in the living room, I understood. They wanted more than my assets. They needed my anger as legal evidence to bury me alive. My name is Talia Winslow. I am 36 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I have made my living by seeing the things other people try to hide. As the Director of Contract Compliance for Halcyon Freight Systems, a massive logistics firm right here in Charlotte, my entire professional existence revolves around the fine print. I catch discrepancies. I spot the hidden clauses. I anticipate the breaches of agreement before the ink even dries. I am notoriously cautious. People in my department joke that I do not even trust the weather forecast without verifying the meteorological data myself. Yet, for all my professional paranoia, I had a catastrophic blind spot when it came to my own marriage. My husband, Grant Mercer, is a commercial real estate developer, or, at least, that is the title he prints on his heavy, embossed business cards. Grant is a man composed entirely of smooth edges and rehearsed charm. He does not just talk, he pitches. Every conversation with him, whether it is about buying groceries or planning a vacation, eventually twists into a slick presentation about growth, leverage, and maximizing our mutual assets. I used to think his relentless ambition was a quirk, a harmless byproduct of his industry. I thought the calculating way he looked at the world stopped at our front door. I was wrong. The first crack in my perfect, carefully managed reality did not happen with a screaming match or a discovered affair. It happened at 6 o'clock in the morning, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. I was standing on the front porch, zipping up my coat, preparing to head to the office early. The neighborhood was completely still. The streetlights were fighting a losing battle against the creeping dawn, and most of the kitchen windows on our block were still pitch black. That was when I noticed the dark gray sedan idling at the end of my driveway. I recognized the car immediately. It belonged to Evelyn Mercer, my mother-in-law. Evelyn and I were not close. For years, she had been a staunch, unyielding defender of her son. Whenever Grant made a questionable financial decision or overstepped a boundary, Evelyn was right there to smooth it over, reminding me that Grant was a visionary who needed my unwavering support. She was a woman who guarded the Mercer family interests with the ferocity of a seasoned general. For her to be sitting in my driveway at 6 in the morning, unannounced, was not just unusual, it was terrifying. I walked down the concrete path, my high heels clicking too loudly in the morning quiet. As I approached the passenger side, the window hummed down. Evelyn did not open the door. She did not even turn to look at me fully. Her hands were locked onto the steering wheel with such force that her knuckles were entirely white. "Evelyn," I said, leaning down slightly, "what are you doing here? Is Grant okay?" She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead on the empty street. Her voice, usually so commanding and sharp, was barely a hoarse whisper. "Do not go home today," she said. I blinked, the chilly morning air suddenly biting at my cheeks. "What are you talking about? I am leaving for work." "Do not go home today," she repeated, her tone hardening, though it trembled at the edges. "Do not be alone with Grant. Do not let them film you." A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. "Film me, Evelyn. Who is them?" She finally turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were rimmed with angry red, and they were swimming with unshed tears. She looked older than I had ever seen her, stripped of her usual composed veneer. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, but she just swallowed hard and shook her head. It was the look of a woman who knew that uttering one more syllable would mean utterly betraying her own flesh and blood. She rolled the window up right in my face, shifted the car into drive, and sped off down the street, leaving me standing alone in the freezing mist. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The sudden vibration made me jump. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Grant. "Morning, beautiful. Just poured my first coffee. Have a good day, babe." It was accompanied by a picture of his ceramic mug resting on our granite kitchen counter. The lighting in the photo was warm and inviting. The message was flawless. It was the text of an attentive, loving husband. It was so perfectly normal that it made my blood run absolutely cold. Grant never texted me this early unless he needed me to do something for him. And he certainly never sent pictures of his coffee. The domestic perfection of it was entirely staged. My thumb hovered over the screen. My instinct, the raw, emotional part of my brain, screamed at me to march right back up that driveway, kick the front door open, and demand to know what on earth was going on. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to ask him why his mother looked like she had seen a ghost. Instead, I opened the smart home security application on my phone. We had cameras installed by the front door, the back patio, and a discreet one in the main hallway. I tapped the icon to load the live feeds. A spinning circle appeared, followed by a gray screen. Connection failed. I checked the system logs. Every single internal and external camera had gone offline at exactly 3 in the morning. I stood there on the damp pavement, staring at the error message, and a profound, chilling clarity washed over me. This was not a marital spat. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a tactical maneuver. Evelyn had told me not to let them film me. The cameras were off. The text message was establishing an alibi of normalcy. Grant was awake inside that house, drinking coffee, waiting for something, waiting for me. In my line of work, when a vendor suddenly goes dark or a set of financial records mysteriously vanishes, you do not call them and ask if they are trying to cheat you. You gather your files. You secure your perimeter. You watch their movements. You let them think they are getting away with it until you have enough evidence to bury them completely. I turned my back on the house. I walked to my own car, unlocked it, and got in. I did not text Grant back. I turned the key in the ignition and drove away. My professional instincts had taken the wheel. I decided right then that I would not react as a confused, emotional wife. I would act as the director of contract compliance. I needed to be in public. I needed witnesses. I needed to document my whereabouts for every single minute of this day. The drive to the Halcyon Freight Systems corporate campus usually took 45 minutes, but the morning traffic was light, and I pulled into the underground parking garage in just under 40. I sat in my car for exactly 2 minutes, practicing my breathing, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in my suit, and locking my panic away in a tight, mental box. I walked into the towering glass lobby of the Halcyon building right as the large digital clock on the wall shifted to 7 in the morning. The space was mostly empty, echoing with the sound of my footsteps. I nodded to the security guard, making sure he saw my face clearly as I swiped my badge at the turnstile. As I approached the main reception desk to grab the morning manifest, Sarah, one of the junior receptionists who always arrived early, stood up quickly. She looked nervous, glancing around the empty lobby before leaning over the high marble counter. "Ms. Winslow," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. I stopped, my heart giving a slight, uncomfortable thud against my ribs. "Yes, Sarah." "Good morning." She pointed a manicured finger toward the small seating area tucked away in the corner of the lobby. "There is a courier waiting for you over there. He arrived about 10 minutes ago." I frowned. A courier? At 7 in the morning, did he say what vendor it is from? Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, he said it is not vendor paperwork. He said he was instructed to hand it to you directly, the second you walked through the doors. He said it was an urgent, personal legal package." I looked over to the corner. A man in a plain windbreaker was sitting on the leather sofa, a thick sealed manila envelope resting on his knees. My mind flashed back to Evelyn's tearful eyes, the disconnected cameras, and Grant's perfectly fabricated text message. The invisible bomb that had been ticking since 6 in the morning was finally about to detonate. I squared my shoulders, adjusted my bag, and walked across the lobby to collect whatever reality Grant had prepared for me. The man on the leather sofa stood up as I approached. He did not smile. He simply asked if I was Talia Winslow, handed me a heavy manila envelope, and thrust an electronic clipboard toward me. I signed my name with a stylus, my hand perfectly steady despite the sudden chill radiating from the package. I did not open it in the lobby. I carried it to the elevator, rode it to the 14th floor, and walked straight into my glass-walled office. I locked the door behind me, closed the blinds, and sat at my mahogany desk. I sliced the envelope open with a metal letter opener. A thick stack of legal documents slid out, bound by a dark blue spine. The header on the first page was printed in a stark, unforgiving font. In the General Court of Justice, District Court Division, petition for exclusive temporary possession of marital residence. I read the petitioner name, Grant Mercer. I forced myself to breathe. I read the grounds for the petition. It stated that I, the respondent, had been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. It claimed I had made credible threats to damage jointly secured assets. It painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on reality, an unpredictable hazard to her own household. I read the words again: erratic, unstable, threats. It was a complete fabrication, entirely foreign to who I am. But it was written with a terrifying, clinical authority. My hands moved automatically, flipping to the back of the petition to examine the supporting documents. My eyes landed on an addendum labeled Exhibit C. This was the moment the blood in my veins turned to ice water. The document listed assets subject to the temporary injunction. Right there, on the second page, was the 50 acres of riverfront property I had inherited from my late father 3 years before I ever met Grant. Just below it was my block of voting shares in Winslow Storage Holdings, my family corporate entity. The document falsely, brazenly categorized them both as commingled assets serving marital interests. It was a lie designed to steal my family legacy. But the true horror was waiting on the final page of the exhibit. Attached was an electronic signature certificate. It verified that the commingling agreement had been digitally signed and authorized by my secure email account. I looked at the timestamp. It read 5:14 in the morning. Today, at 5:14 in the morning, I had been sound asleep. Grant had been awake, drinking coffee, and stealing my identity to forge a legal surrender of my most valuable assets. A sharp knock on my office door made me flinch. I hastily flipped the document over and opened the blinds. It was David, our operations manager. He poked his head inside, looking slightly puzzled. "Morning, Talia," David said. "Just wanted to make sure you got the updated quarterly projections. Also, Grant called my extension about an hour ago." I kept my voice perfectly level. What did he need? "It was a bit strange," David said, leaning against the doorframe. "He asked if you had made it in okay." I said yes. Then he started asking about your schedule today. Wanted to know if you were locked in meetings, if you were going to be leaving the building for lunch, that sort of thing. He said he wanted to surprise you later. But he sounded really intense about making sure you were physically at your desk all morning. The invisible walls of my office suddenly felt like they were closing in. "Thanks, David," I said, managing a tight smile. "I will look at the projections right now." David closed the door. I sat in the suffocating silence, the puzzle pieces slamming together with violent force. Grant did not want to surprise me. Evelyn's warning echoed in my skull. Stay where people can see you. Grant needed to know exactly where I was because he needed to be absolutely certain I was not at home. He was building a narrative of an unstable wife, and he needed me out of the way to set the stage. He needed witnesses to confirm I was far away while he executed his plan. My instinct as a wife was dead. The director of contract compliance took over completely. I did not pick up my phone to scream at my husband. I opened a new folder on my secure desktop and named it simply with today's date. I started building my fortress. I logged into the building security portal and exported the precise timestamp of my badge swipe at the parking garage, the lobby turnstile, and the elevator bank. I took screenshots of my email outbox, showing a steady stream of correspondence proving I was working at my computer. I sent a quiet message to the Information Technology Department, requesting a backup archive of the hallway camera feed outside my office door for the entire working day, citing a routine compliance audit. I created an impenetrable digital alibi proving my exact location minute by minute. Then, I waited. The tension in my office was thick enough to choke on. Every time my phone lit up, my heart hammered against my ribs. At exactly 11:06 in the morning, my phone screen flashed with a critical security alert. It was the smart home application. The notification was brief and brutal. All security devices, including cameras, smart locks, and alarm panels, had been revoked from my administrative account. My access was entirely terminated. I was officially locked out of the digital footprint of my own home. The trap was set, and they were closing the doors. I picked up my desk phone and dialed a number I had kept in my Rolodex for years but never thought I would need. The number belonged to Mara Keene. Mara was a ruthless, brilliant litigator who specialized in the brutal intersection of high-net-worth family disputes and corporate asset theft. She was infamous in Charlotte legal circles for never wasting a single syllable and for destroying opposing counsel with cold, hard documentation. Her assistant answered, tried to put me off, but I used a tone that commanded immediate attention. Tell Mara it is Talia Winslow. Tell her there is a forged electronic signature on a commingled asset agreement involving Winslow Storage Holdings, time-stamped at 5:14 this morning, and a simultaneous petition for exclusive possession of my residence. Mara was on the line within 30 seconds. She did not say hello. Send me the petition and the signature certificate right now, she commanded. Her voice was like crushed glass. I scanned the entire 200-page document and sent it through our encrypted server. We spent the next several hours on an open line. I worked through my regular contract reviews on one monitor, while Mara dissected Grant's legal filings on the other. The deeper she dug, the more venomous her silence became. The afternoon dragged on, shadows stretching across the polished floors of the Halcyon building. My stomach was a knot of acid and dread. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Mara finally broke a long silence. This petition is a placeholder, Mara said, her tone devoid of any comforting warmth. The claims of erratic behavior are extremely specific. They read like a script. He is trying to establish a baseline of instability to justify an emergency injunction that gives him control over the properties before we can challenge the forged appendix. So, what do? I asked, looking out at the city skyline, feeling entirely detached from the world outside my window. Do I go to a hotel? Listen to me very carefully. Talia, Mara said, and for the first time, I heard a sliver of genuine alarm in her voice. You do not go to a hotel, but you absolutely do not go back to that house alone. Not under any circumstances. My mother-in-law said the same thing, I murmured, staring at the revoked access notification still sitting on my phone screen. Your mother-in-law is smart, Mara replied coldly. Look at the pattern. He locked you out of the cameras. He filed a petition claiming you are a threat to the property. He tracked your location at the office to ensure you were away. They are preparing a scene. If this is a trap, they did not set it just to scare you. They set it to catch you on tape reacting exactly the way they described you in this petition. If you walk through that door alone and lose your temper, you hand him the only piece of evidence he is missing. I hung up the phone. The office was quiet. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray. I looked at the legal documents scattered across my desk. My husband had spent months meticulously planning my destruction, weaponizing my own home against me. He wanted a crazy, unstable wife to justify his theft. I packed my briefcase, my movements precise and deliberate. He was not going to get one. By the time my tires crunched onto the familiar gravel of my own driveway, dusk had settled over the property. It was just past 6 in the evening. The fading light cast long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawn. I was not alone. True to her word, Mara sat in the passenger seat, her posture rigid and her eyes scanning the property like a hawk assessing a hunting ground. Parked right behind my car was a county sheriff cruiser. A uniformed civil standby officer, Deputy Miller, stepped out and adjusted his heavy utility belt. I had spent the entire drive bracing my nerves for a screaming match. I expected Grant to be standing in the foyer, armed with his rehearsed talking points, ready to gaslight me into submission. But the reality waiting for me was infinitely more surgical and far more cruel. God. I walked up the front steps, my keys clutched tightly in my right hand. I slid my house key into the deadbolt. It did not turn. I pulled it out and looked at the brass fitting. It was brand new and gleaming. The locks had already been changed. Mara stepped up beside me. She gave a sharp nod to Deputy Miller. The officer bypassed me, raised his fist, and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. A man I had never seen before opened it. He was wearing a polo shirt with a logistics company logo. He looked confused, then visibly alarmed when he saw the badge. "We are here to collect personal belongings and assess the premises," Mara stated, her voice slicing through the crisp evening air. She held up a copy of my identification and a legal notice. "This is the legal resident of the property." The movers stepped aside. I walked into my own house, and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. It did not look like my home anymore. It looked like a crime scene. The entryway was cluttered with heavy-duty cardboard cartons, each one meticulously labeled with thick black marker. Further inside, a sudden blinding flash of white light illuminated the hallway. An interior photographer was adjusting a tall tripod near the fireplace. An appraiser with a digital measuring laser was scanning the dimensions of the vaulted ceiling. Two men in work boots were methodically tagging the antique side tables and the velvet armchair with neon green inventory stickers. They were cataloging my life as if I were already a ghost. I walked slowly into the living room. The space had been entirely neutralized. It possessed a soulless, sterile quality, identical to the aggressively bland staging used for open houses. My personal touches had been erased. The framed photographs from our honeymoon in the Mediterranean were gone. The stack of vintage logistics manuals I kept on the coffee table had vanished. Even the hand-woven throw blanket I always draped over the sofa was missing. They had stripped the room of any evidence that a living, breathing woman actually resided there. My chest tightened, but I did not shout. I remembered my training. I remembered Evelyn. I pivoted sharply and strode down the hall toward my private home office. The heavy wooden door was ajar. I pushed it open and stared at the corner of the room. The steel wall safe, hidden behind a framed landscape painting, hung wide open. The electronic keypad had been forcefully bypassed. I dropped to my knees and peered inside. My grandmother's sapphire necklace was still resting in its velvet box. My emergency cash envelope was completely untouched. They had not come for valuables. Every single document was gone. My physical financial records, the original inheritance deeds to the riverfront property, my old share ledgers, and the certified scanned copies of the Winslow family corporate contracts had been entirely cleaned out. The decorative paperweights and the expensive fountain pens on my desk were left perfectly intact. It was a targeted extraction. They were stealing the paper trail. I stood up, my mind racing, and walked back out toward the kitchen. Spread across the marble island was a thick black binder. The label on the spine read, "Inventory for temporary possession." I flipped it open. The pages were filled with glossy photographs of the stripped-down rooms I had just walked through. Above the photos, a printed heading declared that the respondent, meaning me, had already voluntarily removed the vast majority of her personal belongings. They were creating a fabricated visual history. They were building a paper reality to show the judge that I had already abandoned the marriage and the property. As I turned away from the kitchen island, something caught my eye. High up on the crown molding, tucked discreetly behind a decorative ceramic vase, A tiny pinpoint red light was blinking. I stepped closer, my blood turning to absolute frost. It was a micro-surveillance camera. I calculated the angle instantly. The lens was pointed directly down at the main entryway and the base of the central staircase. It was positioned to capture the exact spot where someone walking through the front door would naturally stand. Suddenly, the entire horrifying architecture of Grant's plan clicked into perfect focus. I heard the front door open again. Mara walked into the foyer, her face a mask of cold fury. Following close behind her was Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow who lived in the brick house directly across the street. "Tell her what you just told me," Mara instructed the older woman. Mrs. Gable looked at me, her wrinkled hands wringing the edge of her woolen cardigan. "Talia, honey," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your husband came over to my porch this afternoon. He was asking the strangest things. He wanted to know what time you usually get home from the office. He asked if I ever heard you yelling through the windows. He even asked if you had ever thrown anything or broken glass when you were angry. He acted like he was so terribly worried about your mental state." I stared at the blinking red light hidden in the corner. I did not feel shock anymore. I felt an absolute, freezing clarity. This was why Evelyn had warned me. This was the trap. Grant knew I would find out about the court filing. He knew I would discover the forged signature. He anticipated that I would come rushing home the second I finished work. Completely unhinged by the betrayal, he had staged the house to look like I was being erased, intending to fuel my panic. He expected me to burst through that front door, find strangers touching my things, and explode into a screaming, violent rage, and that tiny camera was waiting to record every second of my breakdown. He would have taken that video straight to the judge tomorrow morning. He would have played the footage of a hysterical, screaming woman to validate his petition. He would have used my totally justified anger as the ultimate, undeniable proof that I was dangerously unstable and completely unfit to manage my own assets. He was going to use my trauma to legally bury me alive. I took a deep breath. Inhaling the artificial scent of lemon cleaner the stagers had sprayed to mask the scent of our real life. I did not scream. I did not cry. I turned my back to the camera lens. I walked over to the dining room table, which had been commandeered by the appraiser. Amidst the scattered measuring tapes and blank forms, a glossy, oversized architectural brochure had been carelessly tossed aside. I picked it up. The cover featured a stunning, high-resolution watercolor rendering of a massive commercial development. The title across the top was printed in bold, silver letters. It read, Mercer Key. I opened the heavy cardstock pages. It detailed a sprawling complex of luxury waterfront condominiums, high-end retail spaces, and a private marina. But my eyes locked onto the central map, right in the middle of the proposed development. Highlighted in bright, aggressive yellow as the primary foundation block for the entire multi-million-dollar project, was my 50 acres of riverfront property, the land my father had left me, the land Grant had forged my signature to steal. He was not just trying to take my house. He was not just trying to win a divorce settlement. He was trying to build an empire on top of my stolen legacy. I closed the brochure and looked at Mara. The panic was completely gone, replaced by a cold, mathematical calculation. Grant thought he was playing a game of emotional manipulation, but he had made a fatal error. He had left a paper trail, and paper trails were where I was strongest. "Mara," I said, my voice steady and quiet, "tell the deputy we are leaving. Let them finish their fake inventory. We have everything we need." The following morning, the sterile, fluorescent lighting of Mara Keene's downtown law office felt like an interrogation room. We had been sitting at her sprawling glass conference table since 7 o'clock. Fortified only by black coffee and the icy determination settling in my chest. Spread out before us were the legal documents Grant had filed with the court, placed side by side with the heavy, dust-covered archival boxes containing the original Winslow family corporate records. We were hunting for the discrepancy. I knew my father's contracts inside and out. The trap was not the house. The house was merely the stage. The real trap was buried in the paperwork. "Look at this," Mara said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the second page of Grant's submitted asset appendix. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Then, I saw it. The air in the room seemed to thin out. A single, crucial page had been cleanly swapped. In the original family trust documents we had pulled from the archive, there was an ironclad clause explicitly designating the 50 acres of riverfront land as separate. Premarital property, entirely immune to marital commingling, in the version Grant had submitted to the judge. That specific paragraph was completely gone. The page break was perfectly adjusted. It was a masterful forgery. He replaced the page. I breathed, the sheer audacity of the crime making my pulse hammer against my ribs. He actually altered a binding legal exhibit to make it look like I willingly surrendered the land. Mara did not skip a beat. She pulled up the electronic signature certificate that accompanied the forged document. And here is how he executed it. I had my forensic technology team trace the routing data from this certificate. She turned her laptop screen toward me. The digital signature was authorized at 5:14 yesterday morning. But look at the network address. It did not originate from your mobile device. It came from your residential network router, specifically mapped to a backup tablet. I stared at the screen. The tablet. It was an older model we kept in the home office desk drawer, a device Grant exclusively used to read digital newspapers and review architectural blueprints when he did not want to boot up his main workstation. He had sat in our home, while I was asleep down the hall, and used his private tablet to forge my digital consent. "It gets worse," Mara continued, pulling a fresh folder from her briefcase. "While you were dealing with the staging crew last night, I started digging into the corporate entities tied to that Mercer Key brochure you found. I managed to pull a copy of an investment open letter Grant submitted to Rookstone Capital. Rookstone Capital was a massive, predatory bridge loan fund. They financed high-risk, high-reward commercial developments. Mara slid the letter across the glass table. "Read the second paragraph." I traced the text with my finger. Grant had pitched the Mercer Key project to the lenders by explicitly stating that the development possessed the full, unmitigated consensus of the Winslow family. He had leveraged my last name and my stolen land to secure the foundational funding. "Here is the linchpin," Mara said, leaning back and folding her arms. "I checked the public registry of deeds and commercial liens. Rookstone Capital has approved the loan based on this application, but they have not fully dispersed the funds yet. The capital is sitting in escrow, pending a final compliance review." The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Grant was building a castle on a foundation of sand. If we could prove to Rookstone Capital that the asset information had been deliberately misrepresented, the entire financial structure of Mercer Key would instantly collapse before a single brick was ever laid. He would be ruined, just as the gravity of our discovery settled over the room. My cell phone vibrated on the glass table. It was an unknown local number. I hesitated for a second before answering and putting the call on speakerphone. "Talia," a raspy, hurried voice whispered through the speaker. It was Evelyn. "Evelyn?" I asked, exchanging a sharp glance with Mara. "Are you all right?" "I cannot talk long," my mother-in-law said, her words rushing together. "I'm calling from a prepaid phone. I need to tell you what I saw yesterday." I leaned closer to the device. "I am listening." "Before I came to warn you in the driveway," Evelyn confessed, her voice thick with guilt, "I had driven past your house. It was not even 5:30 in the morning. I saw Paige there. Paige Mercer, Grant's younger sister. She was a ruthless, high-end commercial real estate broker who idolized her brother's ambition and shared his complete lack of moral boundaries. Paige was standing on your front lawn," Evelyn continued. "She was directing a camera crew. They were setting up lighting equipment before the sun even came up. That is when I knew Grant was actually going through with it." "Going through with what?" Mara interjected sharply. Evelyn took a shaky breath. Grant is desperate. He showed me the initial draft of the asset petition a few months ago. He tried to frame it as a protective measure for the business. But I worked in the county deed archive department for 25 years. I spent my entire career reviewing property titles and trust documents. I took one glance at the file he left on the dining table, and I recognized exactly what he had done. I saw the replaced page. I saw the deliberately distorted asset descriptions. My heart stopped. Evelyn had known about the forgery for months. "Why did you not tell me?" I demanded, the sting of betrayal flaring up again. "Because he is my son," Evelyn choked out, a sob finally breaking through her composed facade. I wanted to believe he would not actually file it. I wanted to believe he was just making contingency plans. But I had a terrible gut feeling. A mother knows when her child has crossed a line he cannot uncross. "Evelyn," Mara said softly, taking control of the conversation, "did you do anything about that gut feeling?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, Evelyn spoke, her voice suddenly steady, anchored by a quiet, devastating resolve. "Yes, that afternoon. When Grant went out to the patio to take a call, I took out my phone. I took crystal-clear photographs of the original, unaltered asset appendix he had sitting in that folder. The one with your father's signature. The one he destroyed." I looked at Mara. Her eyes were wide, shining with the predatory gleam of a lawyer who had just been handed the ultimate weapon. "Do you still have those photographs?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am sending them to your secure email right now." Evelyn replied, "Talia, I am so sorry. Take him down." The line went dead. A moment later, my laptop chimed with an incoming notification. I opened the email. There it was, a high-resolution image of the original document, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that my land was mine alone. That photograph from Evelyn was the first piece of proof that turned my suspicion into certainty. The moment it reached my inbox, Grant's conspiracy stopped looking like a trap I had barely escaped and started looking like a structure I could dismantle piece by piece. I did not call Grant. I did not leave desperate voicemails demanding an explanation, nor did I send furious text messages threatening exposure. The woman who might have wept over a shattered marriage was left behind in the driveway of that staged house. In her place was a strategist who understood that in a war of attrition, emotion is your most fatal vulnerability. I severed my personal phone line, routing all essential contacts to an encrypted corporate device, and vanished from the domestic battlefield. Halcyon Freight Systems maintained a block of high-end corporate suites downtown for visiting executives. By 8 o'clock that evening, I had secured a keycard to a minimalist, aggressively modern apartment on the 32nd floor. It smelled of ozone and industrial laundry detergent. There were no photographs, no memories, and absolutely no vulnerabilities. It was a sterile command center. I placed my briefcase on the glass dining table, powered up my laptop, and began to architect my husband's ruin. My first target was the fortification of my own perimeter. Winslow Storage Holdings is not a glamorous enterprise. We do not build glass skyscrapers or luxury condominiums. We own vast tracts of heavily zoned industrial land, managing warehouses and logistics hubs that operate quietly and generate massive, steady revenue. It is a quiet giant, and Grant had tried to slip a leash around its neck while I was distracted by the illusion of our marriage. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I convened a closed-door, emergency session of the Winslow Board of Directors. We met in a windowless conference room at my corporate office, not the family estate. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by the men and women who had worked with my father for decades. Nolan Reese, the chairman of the board and my father's oldest confidant, looked deeply troubled. He leaned forward, resting his clasped hands on the polished wood. "Talia," Nolan began, his voice rough with hesitation, "we are glad you called this meeting. There has been an unusual amount of friction internally over the past 6 months. a sustained, aggressive push to fast-track a redevelopment partnership regarding the riverfront parcels. I kept my expression entirely neutral. Where was this pressure originating? Nolan, from inside the Family Trust Advisory Committee. Nolan admitted, looking down at his legal pad. It was presented as a lucrative modernization strategy. They kept insisting that you and Grant were heavily invested in diversifying the portfolio. Honestly, Talia, you have been so overwhelmed with the new corporate compliance rollouts at Halcyon, and with your marriage. None of us wanted to raise a red flag and cause friction if this was genuinely your joint vision. Grant had weaponized my own privacy against me. He had used my professional busyness as a smokescreen to maneuver his pieces on my family's board. There is no joint vision, I stated clearly, my voice ringing off the acoustic panels of the room. Effective immediately, I am enacting a total administrative freeze on all land transfer rights, specifically concerning the 50 acres of riverfront property. I am overriding the current digital authentication protocols. I slid a stack of newly drafted compliance directives down the table. From this exact second forward, no corporate asset can be leveraged, discussed in a letter of intent, or pledged as collateral without my physical, notarized signature applied in the presence of our primary legal counsel. Furthermore, I am revoking all indirect portal access granted to any spouses, extended relatives, or third-party consultants associated with the Mercer family. Cut them off. Blind them entirely. Nolan nodded sharply, relief washing over his weathered face. The board unanimously ratified the freeze. I had successfully locked the vault. Now, I needed to see exactly how much Grant had managed to steal before the doors slammed shut. I bypassed our internal technology department and hired an independent, boutique digital forensics firm based out of Raleigh. I gave them carte blanche and a retainer of $25,000 to excavate the metadata, server logs, and deleted correspondence linking Grant, his sister Paige, and their network of real estate associates to Winslow Storage Holdings. It took the forensic team exactly 48 hours to breach the sophisticated, hidden network of shared drives Grant had established. When the lead investigator handed me the decrypted dossier, the sheer scale of the audacity was breathtaking. Grant had not just forged a single asset appendix. He had systematically turned the Winslow family name into a counterfeit stamp of credibility. The dossier contained dozens of pitch decks, preliminary term sheets, and capital raising projections sent to private equity firms across the eastern seaboard. In every single document, my family's industrial land was listed as the bedrock collateral. He had fabricated board meeting minutes. He had forged letters of intent. He was selling a kingdom he did not own to finance his own desperate ambitions, operating under the absolute assumption that I would never check the fine print until it was too late. But the most sickening revelation buried in the forensic data did not come from my husband. It came from my own blood. The financial analysts had traced a series of obscure, recurring payments masked as strategic consulting fees. The money flowed from a shell marketing company controlled by Paige Mercer directly into a private offshore account. The beneficiary of that account was Brett Winslow, my cousin. Brett sat on the Family Trust Advisory Committee. He was the one who had been pressuring Nolan Reese. He was the inside man, paid off by my husband's sister to keep the board docile, to suppress any deep audits, and to ensure no one looked too closely at the corporate restructuring Grant was quietly pushing through, for a miserable sum of $50,000. My own cousin had sold the keys to the castle. A profound, suffocating anger flared in my chest, hot and violent. My instinct was to summon Brett to my office, throw the bank routing numbers in his face, and destroy him on the spot. I wanted to watch him crumble, but I closed the dossier and took a slow, measured breath. Revenge is not about volume, it is about timing. A traitor who knows he has been caught becomes desperate, unpredictable, and dangerous. But a traitor who believes he is still safely operating in the shadows, he is complacent. He is arrogant. And a calm traitor will always talk too much and make the fatal mistake. I decided to let Brett keep his illusions. I would not confront him. I would let him continue to report back to Paige and Grant, feeding them the false assurance that the Winslow board was still asleep at the wheel. I needed them to feel invincible. I looked at the calendar on my laptop screen. The grand, highly publicized unveiling gala for the Mercer Key project was scheduled for Saturday evening. It was meant to be Grant's crowning achievement. A lavish event designed to dazzle the local politicians, the zoning commissioners, and the wealthy investors he was desperately trying to hook. He had sent out hundreds of embossed invitations, promising a night that would redefine the city's waterfront. He wanted a stage. He wanted the spotlight. I closed the forensic file and smiled into the quiet. Empty apartment. I was not going to stop the gala. I was not going to issue a quiet injunction or send a cease and desist letter behind closed doors. I was going to put on my best evening gown, walk into that ballroom, and let my husband step all the way out into the blinding light. I was going to let him build his glorious, fragile house of cards as high as it could possibly go, right in front of the entire city. Before I pulled the foundational document straight out from under his feet, the grand ballroom of the Biltmore Hotel was suffocatingly bright. Crystal chandeliers cast a brittle, fractured light over a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. It was the annual Metropolitan Investors Charity Gala, an event where the city elite gathered to pretend their primary motivation was philanthropy rather than aggressive networking. For Grant, it was the ultimate stage. He had positioned himself perfectly near the center of the room, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, holding court among a circle of men whose combined net worth could rival a small nation. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that fit him with predatory perfection. From my vantage point near the carved ice sculpture, I watched him perform. He was magnificent at it. He deployed the exact right measure of humility when accepting compliments, followed immediately by a sharp, charismatic pivot to his grand vision. Tonight, he was playing the role of the devoted family man and the brilliant urban pioneer. He was the man building a glorious future, hand in hand with his wife. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically taste it on the rim of my champagne flute. Dominating the far wall of the ballroom was a massive digital projection screen. As the string quartet finished their set, the screen flared to life, displaying a breathtaking, three-dimensional rendering of Mercer Key. The animation swooped over virtual glass towers, luxury promenades, and a pristine private marina. But the focal point, bathed in a warm, golden, digitally rendered sunlight, was the expansive tract of riverfront land. The presentation showcased it as the undisputed, fully secured cornerstone of the entire multi-million-dollar complex. Paige Mercer was circulating the perimeter of the room, her movements practically vibrating with premature triumph. She wore a backless emerald dress and a smile so aggressively confident it bordered on threatening. She was already spending her commission in her head. I watched her sidle up to a group of senior executives from Rookstone Capital, touching their arms lightly, laughing at jokes she barely heard, and speaking of the development as an absolute certainty. At 8:30, the master of ceremonies tapped his microphone, signaling the main presentation. Grant ascended the small stage with the effortless grace of a born politician. He spoke eloquently about urban revitalization, about community, and about honoring the history of the city while pushing it toward a breathtaking tomorrow. "But none of this," Grant said, his voice dropping an octave to achieve a tone of manufactured reverence, "would be possible without the bedrock of family. A project of this magnitude requires absolute trust and a shared, unbreakable vision for the future." He turned his gaze directly toward me. The spotlight shifted, blinding me for a fraction of a second. "I want to invite my extraordinary wife, Talia, to join me up here," Grant announced, extending his hand. The ballroom erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. "This endeavor is a partnership in every sense of the word. We are building this legacy together." He expected me to be paralyzed by the pressure of the crowd. He expected the social conditioning of our circles to force me into compliance. He wanted me to smile, nod, and silently validate his theft in front of the very people funding it. I handed my half-empty glass to a passing waiter. I smoothed the skirt of my charcoal silk dress and walked up the steps. I took his offered hand. His grip was entirely too tight. A silent, vicious warning wrapped in a public display of affection. I smiled back at him, a curve of the lips that did not reach my eyes, and accepted the microphone. The ballroom fell into an expectant hush. Hundreds of eyes were locked on me, waiting for the supportive, dutiful wife to deliver her rehearsed lines of encouragement. "Thank you, Grant," I began, my voice clear and perfectly modulated, echoing through the cavernous room. It is truly fascinating to look at that screen and see such a massive undertaking conceptualized so beautifully. My husband has always possessed an extraordinary imagination. I paused, letting the silence stretch just a heartbeat too long. I locked eyes with the lead underwriter from Rookstone Capital seated at the front table. "However," I continued, raising my chin slightly, "in my experience overseeing corporate compliance, I have learned a very hard lesson. There are ambitions that sound extraordinarily noble, right up until the paperwork is examined under the proper light." I did not raise my voice. I did not glare. I delivered the sentence with the light, breezy tone of an insider sharing a mildly amusing professional anecdote. I handed the microphone back to Grant, offered the audience one final, enigmatic smile, and gracefully descended the stairs. For 3 agonizing seconds, the ballroom was dead silent. Then, a smattering of uncertain, polite laughter rippled through the crowd, mostly from the socialites who assumed it was a dry, self-deprecating joke about the tedious nature of legal work. But the real players in the room did not laugh. I watched the shift happen in real time. The senior investors, the risk analysts, the men and women who actually controlled the capital, suddenly stopped looking at the beautiful digital rendering on the screen. They started looking at Grant. They looked at him longer than was polite. Eyes narrowed. Whispers started behind raised hands. I had not explicitly accused him of anything, but I had introduced a single, lethal drop of doubt into the pristine waters of his pitch. I had let them smell a very faint wisp of smoke inside the walls of his flawless presentation. As I navigated through the murmuring crowd, I glanced toward the dimly lit alcove near the coat check. Standing there, completely isolated from the Mercer family table, was Evelyn. She was dressed in a simple, understated gray suit. She did not mingle. She did not smile. Her physical distance from her son and daughter-in-law was a glaring, silent billboard to anyone paying attention. In our world, optics are everything, and the matriarch, refusing to sit at the table of honor, confirmed the fracture I had just hinted at on stage. The remainder of the evening was a masterclass in suffocating tension. Grant maintained his charming facade, but the muscles in his jaw were ticking furiously. Paige shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom across the buffet line, realizing her easy payday might be standing on shaky ground. I left the ballroom precisely at 10 o'clock. Retrieving my coat from the attendant, I walked out into the cool, damp night air, heading toward the valet stand. "Talia, wait." Grant's voice cut through the hum of the idling luxury cars. I stopped and turned. He emerged from the revolving doors, his perfect composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. He walked over to me, shedding the visionary businessman persona and adopting the patronizing, negotiating tone I knew all too well. "That was a cute stunt up there," Grant said, his voice low and tight. "Very cryptic, very dramatic. But you and I both know you are playing a losing hand." I said nothing, merely raising an eyebrow. Grant stepped closer, invading my personal space. "Let us stop the theatrics. I am offering you a peace treaty right now. I know you are stressed. I know you feel slighted. So, here is the deal. You get the house. I will withdraw the petition for exclusive possession first thing Monday morning. I will arrange a very generous, permanent monthly allowance that will keep you comfortable for the rest of your life. And we put an end to all this ugly legal maneuvering." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. All you have to do, Grant continued, his eyes cold and calculating, is come into my lawyer's office at 9 o'clock on Monday morning and sign the formal asset ratification. You sign off on the land, you keep the house, and you walk away with your dignity intact before this gets truly humiliating for you. He was trying to buy his way out of the trap he had built, using my own money to do it. He honestly believed his psychological warfare over the past few days. The lockout, the cameras, the forged court filings, had broken my resolve. He thought I was terrified of a public, messy divorce. I looked at the folded paper in his hand, then up at his desperately confident face. I did not slap him. I did not spit on his shoes. I allowed my shoulders to slump a fraction of an inch, perfectly mimicking the posture of an exhausted, defeated woman looking for a way out of a nightmare. I will consider it, Grant, I said softly, looking away from him. I saw the immediate flash of victory in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought the pressure had worked. Monday morning, he repeated, a smug satisfaction bleeding back into his voice. Do the smart thing, Talia. I turned around, handed my ticket to the valet, and got into my car. As I drove away from the glittering hotel, leaving my husband standing on the curb basking in his false victory, my hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute, iron certainty. He wanted me to do the smart thing on Monday morning. I fully intended to. The rain was coming down in heavy, relentless sheets when I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a diner on the outskirts of the county line. It was 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, the day after the charity gala. The diner was a relic from a forgotten decade, smelling of stale coffee, burnt grease, and damp wool. It was the exact kind of place where nobody from our social circle would ever be caught dead. That was precisely why Evelyn had chosen it. I walked into the dimly lit establishment and spotted her sitting in a corner booth. She wore a faded trench coat, her hands wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug. She looked utterly exhausted, the carefully maintained armor of the wealthy matriarch completely stripped away. I slid into the vinyl seat across from her. I did not order anything. I just waited. Grant thinks he has you cornered, Evelyn began, her voice barely a scrape above the hum of the diner refrigerator. He actually believes you are going to walk into his lawyer's office tomorrow morning and sign your life away just to keep that house. He made that very clear last night, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Evelyn closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, the raw, unfiltered truth was finally staring back at me. Talia, you need to understand the reality of what is happening. Grant is not expanding his career. He is not building a new legacy. He is desperately trying to patch a catastrophic hole. I frowned, leaning forward over the sticky formica table. What hole that 2 years ago he aggressively pursued a massive commercial flipping deal down in Atlanta, Evelyn said, her hands trembling slightly against her mug. He was entirely too confident. He bypassed the usual risk assessment protocols and structured the financing with a predatory private equity firm. The zoning board rejected his permits. The entire project died on the vine, but the debt did not. He lost millions of dollars. Worse than that, to secure the initial funding, Grant signed a massive personal guarantee. He put everything he legally owns on the line. The air in the diner suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The pieces were shifting, forming a completely different picture. Grant was not acting out of sheer greed. He was acting out of pure, unadulterated terror. If he does not lock down that bridge loan from Rookstone Capital for the Mercer Key project by the end of this week, Evelyn continued, her voice tight with suppressed agony, the creditors from Atlanta are going to call in his personal guarantee. He will be entirely liquidated. He will lose his firm, his reputation, and every single cent to his name. He is drowning. Talia, and your 50 acres of riverfront land is the only life raft big enough to keep him from going under. It was a bitter, leaden realization. He had never targeted my house or my pride out of malice. Those were just tools, He needed my inherited land to save his own skin, and he was willing to destroy my sanity to get it. "The camera in the living room," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "You knew about it." "I figured it out too late," Evelyn confessed, a tear finally escaping and cutting a path down her powdered cheek. "I knew he and Paige were staging the house, but it was only when I saw the invoice from the private security contractor on his desk that morning that I realized they had planted a hidden recording device. That was why I drove to your house at 6 in the morning. I knew they needed you to walk into that manufactured nightmare and lose your temper. They needed you to look crazy on tape so the judge would grant the emergency injunction immediately." She reached into her oversized handbag and pulled out a manila envelope. She slid it across the table. "There is something else," she whispered. "Grant told the court he only needed temporary, exclusive possession of the marital home for stability. That was another lie." I opened the envelope. Inside was a printed email thread between Paige Mercer and a luxury real estate photographer. Attached was a fully drafted, glossy listing for my house. The asking price was aggressive. The marketing copy was finalized. "Paige prepared that draft listing 3 days ago," Evelyn said. "They never intended to live in that house, and they certainly never intended to give it back to you. They were going to use the temporary possession order to legally lock you out, sell the property out from under you to an all-cash luxury buyer, and pump the liquid funds directly into Grant's failing accounts to hold off his creditors until the Rookstone loan cleared." I stared at the pristine photographs of my living room, the same room that had been sterile and empty just 48 hours ago. The betrayal was so layered, so meticulously calculated. It felt like cold steel pressing against my throat. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and looked at the woman who had just handed me the rope to hang her own son. "Thank you, Evelyn," I said softly. I left the diner and drove straight to Mara Keene's office. It was Sunday, but Mara was already there. Her desk covered in the forensic accounting reports we had pulled from the Winslow corporate servers. I dropped Evelyn's envelope onto the glass table and relayed everything I had just learned. Mara did not flinch. She simply absorbed the information, her eyes sharpening into dark, lethal points. "This changes the timeline," Mara said, tapping a silver pen against her notepad. "If he is facing a margin call from previous creditors, his back is completely against the wall. That explains why Brett Winslow was so crucial to their operation." Mara pulled a specific internal memorandum from the stack of forensic files. It was the document Brett had signed in exchange for his consulting fee from Paige. "Look at how your cousin classified your property in this internal committee report," Mara instructed, pointing to a highlighted paragraph. I read the text. Brett had deliberately drafted a memo summarizing the Winslow asset portfolio, but he had subtly shifted the designation of my 50 acres. He had buried a clause defining my privately inherited riverfront parcel as an operational asset functioning in service of the broader corporate logistics network. He reclassified it, I realized, the sheer mechanics of the fraud making my stomach turn. Brett created an internal paper trail suggesting my private land was actually being used to generate revenue for the family business. That paved the way for Grant to argue in his court filings that the land was commingled. "Joint property?" "Exactly," Mara confirmed, her voice crackling with dangerous energy. "Your cousin provided the corporate cover story your husband needed to justify the theft." Mara stood up, walked over to a towering mahogany bookshelf, and pulled down a massive, leather-bound volume. It was the original, Founding Charter of Winslow Storage Holdings, drafted by my late father over 30 years ago. The book was heavy, smelling of old paper and binding glue. She dropped it onto the glass desk with a heavy thud and flipped precisely to a section near the back. "Your father was a very cautious man, Talia," Mara said, her finger tracing down a column of dense, archaic legal text. "I spent the last 4 hours reading his original bylaws. He built this company from the ground up, and he knew exactly what happens when money marries into a family." She tapped the page firmly. "Read Article 7, Section 4. I leaned over the ancient text. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was as clear and sharp as a guillotine blade. The clause stipulated that if any board member, executive officer, or family trustee intentionally misrepresented separate, inherited private property as corporate collateral or joint operational assets without explicit, notarized written consent from the inheritor, it constituted a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. And the penalty? I asked, my heart beginning to hammer a slow, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The penalty, Mara said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face, is the immediate, automatic termination of all board privileges, followed by a mandatory, forced buyout of the offending party's shares at a severely penalized rate of 10 cents on the dollar. I stared at the leather-bound book. My breath caught in my throat. My father had not just left me a logistics empire and a piece of valuable land. He had anticipated the vultures. He had known that one day someone might try to use the corporate structure to steal my birthright. He had quietly, brilliantly woven a fatal trapwire into the very foundation of the company. Grant thought he was the master architect. He thought he had outsmarted me by manipulating my cousin and forging my name. But he had blindly walked into a legal minefield designed by a man who was 10 times the strategist he could ever hope to be. Brett's internal memo triggers this clause perfectly, Mara stated, closing the heavy book, and by proxy, it completely annihilates the foundation of Grant's claim to Rookstone Capital. I looked out the window of Mara's office, watching the rain wash the city streets clean. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a heavy, cold weight in my chest, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had calcified into something entirely different. It had become a weapon. I finally understood the full architecture of the trap, and I was holding the detonator. Tomorrow was Monday. Grant was expecting me to surrender. I could hardly wait to see his face. The digital forensics team operating out of Raleigh delivered their final comprehensive report by late Sunday afternoon. I sat alone at the glass dining table in my corporate suite, the sharp artificial glow of the laptop screen reflecting off my eyes. Every ounce of emotional turbulence had completely vacated my body. I was no longer a betrayed wife reeling from the destruction of her marriage. I was a senior compliance auditor examining a severely compromised ledger. The data illuminating my screen was brutally precise. We began with the digital signature. The initial trace had pointed to a backup tablet, but the deep forensic dive excavated the exact architecture of the forgery. The signature executed at 5:14 in the morning did not merely bounce off our residential wireless router. The routing data proved it was manually processed through Grant's dedicated, hardwired desktop workstation, utilizing a specific local area network backup protocol that he alone had the administrative credentials to access. The keystroke logs and the automated system registry timestamps created an undeniable digital fingerprint. It proved, beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt, that he was physically sitting in his leather desk chair, wide awake and operating his own machine. Precisely at the moment he claimed I was the one signing away my inheritance. Next, I constructed my own impenetrable fortress of an alibi. I bypassed standard channels and had my information technology director at Halcyon Freight Systems pull a total, minute-by-minute diagnostic of my Tuesday. The resulting file was a masterpiece of corporate surveillance. I had my security badge swipe at the parking turnstile exactly at 7 o'clock in the morning. I had continuous, high-definition video feeds of me walking the 14th floor hallways. I had calendar invites with my accepted digital responses, outgoing email timestamps, and even the logged activity of my desktop mouse. I possessed a continuous, indisputable record proving that while Grant was alleging I was unstable and wandering the streets, I was entirely sober, deeply engaged in high-level contract negotiations, and surrounded by dozens of professional witnesses for 9 solid hours. Then came the physical timeline of the house itself. Mrs. Gable, the vigilant neighbor across the street, possessed a top-of-the-line, motion-activated security camera mounted discreetly above her front gate. Mara had dispatched a private investigator to collect the encrypted hard drive. The video files we extracted painted a damning, high-resolution picture of premeditation. The timestamps at the bottom of the footage showed the locksmith van, the appraiser's silver sedan, and Page's private camera crew arriving at our property exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes before the district courthouse doors even opened to accept Grant's emergency petition. They were not scrambling to secure a property in response to a sudden, violent outburst from a dangerous wife. They were methodically constructing a movie set long before the fictional script was even legally filed with a judge. The financial and operational metadata provided the final, fatal blows. Mara's technology team ripped the hidden data tags from the draft real estate listing Evelyn had uncovered. The document creation date proved that Page had begun formatting the commercial sale of my marital home 3 entire weeks prior to Grant filing his petition for temporary possession. But tracing the money was the most satisfying endeavor of all. The so-called consulting fees paid to my cousin Brett were heavily masked, but not heavily enough. The capital flowed from Winslow Storage Holdings into a newly minted shell marketing entity incorporated in Delaware. The registered agent for that obscure entity was, unsurprisingly, Page Mercer, from that Delaware account. The digital ledger drew a straight, undeniable line of wire transfers flowing directly into the primary holding corporation designed to manage and fund the Mercer Key development. It was a perfectly enclosed, undeniable loop of corporate fraud, familial bribery, and grand theft. We possessed enough verified ammunition to level a city block. We could have called the police right then. We could have filed an immediate motion for sanctions and watched him get arrested. But deploying all that ordnance at once in a chaotic, screaming confrontation would be a terrible waste of leverage. I wanted a systemic, inescapable collapse. I instructed Mara to draft a highly sanitized, painfully routine compliance inquiry. We did not send it to Grant. We did not send it to his attorney. We sent it directly to the Senior Risk Management Division at Rookstone Capital. The letter did not explicitly accuse Grant Mercer of forgery or fraud. It simply stated, in the dry, polite, impenetrable language of corporate attorneys, that the Winslow family legal counsel had identified a potential, unverified discrepancy regarding the chain of title and the specific asset classification on the riverfront parcel serving as collateral for the pending bridge loan. It cordially advised a standard, secondary legal review by the lender prior to any final capital disbursement, purely as a measure of mutual protection. It was a masterclass in professional understatement. It was entirely too polite to reveal our hand, but it was severe enough to slam the brakes on a multi-million-dollar financial instrument right before the ink dried. In the world of institutional lending, the mere whisper of an encumbered asset title is enough to freeze a room full of bankers in their tracks. We knew the final signing meeting with Rookstone was scheduled for Monday afternoon. Our polite little letter ensured that the meeting would not be a celebration, while I was meticulously architecting his professional execution. My encrypted secondary phone began to vibrate softly against the glass table. Grant had abruptly, violently shifted his entire strategy. The arrogant, aggressive negotiator who had cornered me outside the charity gala the night before had completely vanished. In his place was a carefully constructed ghost of the man I had married, desperately attempting to weaponize our shared history. My screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. He sent a candid photograph from our 3rd anniversary trip to the coast, the one where we were laughing on the deck of a rented sailboat. Following the image was a long, meandering text message. He wrote about how the suffocating pressure of the development project had blinded him to what truly mattered. He wrote about how much he missed the sound of my laugh filling the kitchen. He offered half-hearted, vague apologies for letting things get so adversarial, promising that if I just came to the lawyer's office on Monday and signed the agreement, we could take a long vacation and rebuild our foundation. He was deploying nostalgia as a chemical anesthetic. He was trying to inject our romantic history into my veins, hoping to numb my resolve, soften my anger, and make me pliable before the sun came up on Monday morning. I sat in the quiet, sterile apartment and read every single word he sent. I looked at the photograph of my own smiling face on that boat. My pulse did not elevate by a single beat. My breathing remained perfectly even. I did not type out a furious, emotional reply. I did not demand an explanation for his lies. I did not tell him that I knew everything. I simply pressed the power button, locking the screen, and placed the phone face down on the table. I turned my attention back to the laser printer humming quietly in the corner of the room. I stood up and gathered the freshly printed pages as they slid out. The complex network logs isolating his desktop computer. The airtight corporate alibi from Halcyon. The stamped video stills from Mrs. Gable's security camera. The extracted metadata from Page's real estate listing. The financial routing numbers linking Brett's betrayal directly to the Mercer key accounts. I stacked the papers on the table. I tapped the bottom edge against the glass, aligning them perfectly. I opened a fresh, unblemished manila folder and slipped the documents inside, smoothing the cover flat with the palm of my hand. There were no tears. There were no raised voices. There was no broken glass or dramatic screaming. There was just the quiet, terrifying weight of verifiable data. A neatly organized, flawlessly documented stack of paper can kill a person's future far more effectively than any weapon on earth. I placed the folder into my leather briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut. I was entirely ready for Monday. The schedule for Monday was engineered to be a meat grinder. It was a brilliantly constructed vice, designed to apply compounding pressure until my will completely snapped. At 9 a.m, we were docketed for the emergency family court hearing regarding the exclusive possession of my home. At exactly 12 noon, the final capital disbursement meeting was scheduled in the executive boardroom of Rookstone Capital. And to cap off his anticipated triumph, Grant had booked a private dining room at the most expensive steakhouse in Charlotte for 8 o'clock in the evening to celebrate with his new financial partners. He believed this aggressive timeline worked entirely in his favor. His strategy was glaringly obvious. He intended to corner me in the unforgiving, fluorescent-lit corridors of the county courthouse, use the impending threat of a public spectacle to break my nerve, and then march me directly over to the lenders as a thoroughly defeated, compliant wife. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:45. I deliberately chose a faded beige trench coat and applied absolutely no makeup. I let my posture sag, allowing my shoulders to curve inward. I practiced keeping my eyes dull and unfocused, projecting the exact image of a woman who had spent the entire weekend suffocating under the weight of her husband's psychological warfare. Grant was waiting near the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4. He was flanked by his aggressive, high-priced divorce attorney. But the moment he saw me walking down the marble hall with Mara, he held up a hand to stop his counsel and stepped forward to intercept me. He looked spectacular. His suit was immaculate, and his face was arranged in an expression of deep, manufactured sympathy. He gently guided me a few steps away from the crowd, lowering his voice into a smooth, comforting baritone. "Talia," Grant murmured, his eyes scanning my exhausted face with triumphant satisfaction. "You look terrible. It does not have to be this way. I can make all of this stop right now." I looked down at the polished floor, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" "Grant, I want peace." He lied beautifully. "I am offering you a final way out. I will instruct my lawyer to withdraw the petition for the house the second court opens. I will drop the narrative about your mental health. We will keep our private lives private, and we will maintain the image of a united family. All you have to do is sign the formal asset ratification before we go to Rookstone at noon. You give me the land, and I give you your life back." He was offering me a reprieve from the very fire he had set. It was a hostage negotiation disguised as an olive branch. I let out a long, shaky breath. I closed my eyes for a 2 count, playing the part of a cornered animal realizing there was no escape. "I just want this nightmare to be over," I whispered. Grant smiled. It was a small, tight curve of his lips, but it radiated absolute victory. He firmly believed he had crushed me. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, a patronizing gesture of false comfort. "Then do the smart thing today. babe. Trust me." We walked into the courtroom. The air was stale, smelling of floor wax and old wood. When the judge called our docket number, Grant's attorney stood up, ready to present their fabricated narrative of my instability. But Mara Keene was already on her feet. She did not launch into a passionate defense. She did not accuse Grant of perjury. Instead, she respectfully addressed the bench and executed a flawless tactical maneuver. "Your Honor," Mara stated, her tone entirely professional and devoid of emotion. "The respondent respectfully requests a brief continuance of this preliminary hearing until 3 o'clock this afternoon. We have just received a substantial cache of digital forensics related to the petitioner's evidentiary exhibits, specifically regarding the preparation timeline of the documents submitted to this court. We require a few hours to properly process this data before we can adequately address the claims." Grant's attorney objected, but the judge, noting the seriousness of new forensic evidence, granted the delay. The hearing was bumped to the afternoon session. I watched Grant from the corner of my eye. He looked momentarily annoyed by the procedural hiccup, checking his heavy silver wristwatch, but the annoyance quickly faded into smug indifference. In his mind, the delay was irrelevant. He had secured my verbal surrender in the hallway. He assumed I was still going to sign the papers at noon to make the afternoon hearing disappear entirely. He even caught my gaze across the aisle and gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. We exited the courthouse and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Evelyn was waiting by the stone pillars near the street, wrapped in a heavy wool coat. She looked physically ill, her skin pale and drawn, but her posture was rigid with determination. I walked over to her. She reached out and grasped my hands. Her fingers were freezing. "I spoke to the civil standby officer from your house," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I told him what I saw. I am prepared to do whatever is necessary. If I am forced to stand up in front of strangers today and testify against my own son, I will do it. I will not let him destroy you." "Thank you, Evelyn," I said, squeezing her cold hands. "Just be ready by the phone." As Mara and I walked toward the parking garage, my encrypted phone buzzed. It was Brett. I answered and put the device on speaker. "Talia," my cousin gasped, the sound of sheer panic vibrating through the speaker. "I just received an emergency notification from Nolan Reese. The board is convening a disciplinary review this afternoon." "What is going on?" "We are family. You cannot blindside me like this. Please, let us just sit down and handle this internally. Do not freeze me out." He had finally realized the trap was springing, and he was desperately trying to save his own skin. He wanted the comfort of a private family squabble to shield him from corporate ruin. I stopped walking. The defeated, exhausted wife from the courthouse hallway vanished instantly. What remained was the part of me that knew exactly how to deal with fraud. "There is no private salvation for you, Brett," I said, my voice cutting through the garage like a razor. "You sold my birthright for a consulting fee. You have exactly two choices right now. You can walk into that boardroom this afternoon and tell Nolan the absolute truth about what Paige paid you to do, or you can go down with the ship. Choose quickly." I hung up before he could utter another pathetic excuse. The drive to the financial district was silent. The Rookstone Capitol building was a towering obelisk of dark glass and steel, a temple dedicated to ruthless ambition and institutional wealth. We rode the silent, high-speed elevator to the 42nd floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of white marble and minimalist leather furniture. At precisely 5 minutes to 12, a young assistant with a flawless smile escorted us down a long corridor toward the main executive boardroom. The walls were made entirely of soundproof glass. I looked through the transparent barrier. Grant was already seated at the center of the massive, polished granite table. He was flanked by Paige, who was practically vibrating with anticipation, and his team of real estate attorneys. Across from them sat the senior underwriters and risk managers of Rookstone Capital, men and women who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars. Grant looked up and saw me approaching the glass doors. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, incredibly confident smile spreading across his handsome face. He looked like a man who had successfully conquered the world. He truly believed I was walking into that room to hand him the final piece of his empire. I adjusted my grip on the thin, spotless manila folder in my right hand. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside. The executive boardroom of Rookstone Capital smelled of expensive leather and absolute authority. Grant was holding court, leaning forward with his hands steepled on the polished granite table. He was summarizing the Mercer Key development as a deal that was already 90% closed, projecting the aura of a visionary who was merely humoring the final bureaucratic formalities, and with the full, unwavering backing of the Winslow estate. Grant concluded smoothly, sliding a heavy gold-plated pen across the table toward me alongside the final asset ratification document. We are ready to break ground, Talia, if you would. He looked at me with a gaze so intensely confident it was almost hypnotic. He genuinely believed the psychological crushing he had orchestrated over the weekend had worked. I reached for the pen. My fingers brushed the cool metal. Excuse me, Mr. Mercer, before Mrs. Mercer signs anything, we need to pause the proceedings. The voice belonged to Arthur Sterling, the lead compliance attorney for Rookstone. He sat at the far end of the table, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He did not look at Grant. His eyes were fixed entirely on a single piece of paper in front of him. Our risk management division received a formal notice of discrepancy this morning regarding the core collateral, Sterling stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. We are required to conduct a final review of the asset confirmation before any capital can be legally dispersed. Grant's perfectly practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Arthur, I assure you, the collateral is completely unencumbered. My wife is sitting right here to ratify the joint asset inclusion. I am not here to ratify anything, I said. My voice was quiet, but in that soundproof glass room, it rang out like a gunshot. I let go of the gold pen. It rolled slightly, clinking against the granite. I unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out the crisp manila folder I had prepared the night before. I am here to demonstrate precisely why this institution should not lend a single cent to this man. I continued, opening the folder. I slid the first document across the smooth stone table directly to Arthur Sterling. This is a time-stamped photograph of the original Winslow family asset appendix. It explicitly designates the 50 acres of riverfront land as separate, premarital property. It was photographed on Grant's desk months ago. I slid the second document next to it. This is the fabricated version Grant submitted to the county court yesterday morning, with the protective clause entirely removed. The silence in the room deepened, becoming dense and suffocating. The Rookstone executives leaned forward, their expressions shifting from polite interest to severe alarm. I did not stop. The rhythm of my vengeance was set. I placed the third file down. This is a certified digital forensics report. It proves that the electronic signature surrendering my land, time-stamped at 5:14 in the morning, was manually executed from Grant's private desktop computer while I was asleep. Grant's face drained of all color. The charismatic developer vanished, replaced by a man staring into an open grave. Talia, he hissed, dropping the facade entirely. Stop this right now. Then we have the matter of the emergency court petition he filed. Claiming I am violently unstable, I said, ignoring him completely. I laid down the fourth and fifth documents. Here are the security camera logs from my neighbor, proving Grant hired a staging crew and a locksmith to lock me out of my own home nearly 3 hours before the court opened. And right beside it, the metadata from a drafted real estate listing prepared by his sister, Paige, proving they intended to liquidate my house before a judge ever reviewed the case. The collective realization hit the Rookstone side of the table like a physical blow. Grant had not simply exaggerated his financial standing. He had fabricated a legal narrative to corner the true property owner, attempting to use institutional lending to launder a stolen inheritance. I turned my attention to the internal architecture of the fraud. Furthermore, as the majority shareholder of Winslow Storage Holdings, I have officially activated the dismissal clause within our corporate charter. The internal memorandum reclassifying the land, signed by Brett Winslow, is hereby null and void. The board is currently convening an emergency audit of every single transaction associated with Mercer Key. Paige Mercer slammed her hands on the table, her emerald eyes flashing with desperate fury. You cannot do this. We have binding letters of intent. We have everything aligned. You have a shell company in Delaware, I interrupted, my voice slicing through her panic. I tossed the final bank routing summary onto the pile. A shell company you used to funnel $50,000 in bribery fees to my cousin to keep the board quiet. You also have a drafted real estate listing for a house you do not own. Your status as a broker and a negotiator in this room is completely finished. Paige shrank back into her chair, the fight instantly evaporating as she stared at the indisputable paper trail of her own corruption. Grant suddenly slammed his fist onto the granite. He transitioned wildly from arrogant denial to explosive anger, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are overreacting. You are burning down our entire future because of a misunderstanding I was trying to save our finances. The heavy glass door to the boardroom opened. Evelyn Mercer stepped inside. She had been waiting in the reception area, guided by my attorney to enter exactly on cue. Grant stared at his mother, completely paralyzed. It was not a misunderstanding, Grant, Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, carrying the heavy, authoritative grief of a mother recognizing her son's ultimate failure. You set a trap. You installed hidden cameras in the living room, and you waited for her to come home and break down. I know this because I am the one who drove to her house at 6 a.m. to warn her not to walk into it. That was the final nail. The mother of the borrower had just walked into the lender's boardroom to testify to his premeditated malice. Arthur Sterling stood up, gathering the documents I had provided. Mr. Mercer, Rookstone Capital is immediately freezing all pending loan applications associated with your firm. This meeting is over. The investors did not say another word. They packed their briefcases and filed out of the room, leaving the grand vision of Mercer Key dead on the table. The entire narrative of the unstable, erratic wife had been utterly annihilated 3 hours before the afternoon court session even began. Grant was left sitting in the crushing silence of his own ruin. A few weeks later, the dust finally settled. The emergency petition for exclusive possession of my home was quietly and quickly withdrawn. The Mercer Key development collapsed entirely, leaving a massive crater in the local commercial real estate market. Brett was unceremoniously ousted from his position of influence within the family trust, banished to the outer fringes of the corporate structure. Paige lost 3 of her most lucrative commercial clients after whispers of her fraudulent shell company circulated through the broker network. As for Grant, the creditors from his previous failures called in his personal guarantees. He lost his firm. He lost his cars. He currently resides in a rented, moderately upscale apartment, left with nothing but a hollowed-out reputation he had destroyed with his own 2 hands. I kept my 50 acres of riverfront land. I spent the following month restructuring Winslow Storage Holdings, implementing a fortress of transparent digital authentication protocols. But my most satisfying maneuver was the final one. I took the exact parcel of land they had intended to use for their towering, deceitful luxury complex, and I broke ground on a state-of-the-art logistics training center. I named the facility after my late father. Looking back, I realized that the most painful revenge you can inflict upon a traitor is not screaming in their face or throwing their belongings onto the front lawn. The ultimate retribution is simply walking away, letting them build their magnificent castle of lies, and then pulling the single, authentic document that causes every single room to collapse under the crushing weight of the truth. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me by pressing the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people.